Mohammed Desai, the national coordinator of BDS South Africa, joins me in studio, and over Skype I'm joined by David Sheen. He's a journalist from Dimon in Israel. Mr. Sheen, perhaps I'll start with you. Can you describe the way the Zionist Union and Likud ran their campaigns in Israel and what happened after the elections?
Well, the Zionist Union's campaign was pretty lackluster, you'd have to say, in the sense they didn't articulate an alternative vision. They didn't tell voters what they could expect, except not Netanyahu. That probably was a large factor in their not receiving sufficient votes to topple Netanyahu. For Netanyahu's part, his campaign pretty much consisted of the usual fear, emphasis on fear, specifically, of course, the classic Iran, the classic, Palestinians, but specifically this time, it wasn't only about Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, but Palestinian citizens of Israel. And he repeatedly mentioned over and over that there is a threat that they will actually come out to the polls and vote, and that this was the motivating factor he used to bring his core out to the election.
Mohammed, what's your reaction to the Israel election results?
Well, a sad day for peace and justice-loving people that we now have to live with a war criminal for another term. This is the same person that oversaw the deaths of over 2,000 people last year, more than 500 of them children. However, as BDS South Africa and as a larger movement creating pressure on Israel, we hope to intensify our action because, as the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, writing in today's Haaretz newspaper, said, that the only hope is that now the world will eventually act and that this is Israel's only consolation, or Israelis' only consolation.
I'm also joined on the phone line by Avram Kengel, the president of the SA Zinias Federation. Talk to us about your views on the Israel election results.
Well, I think the most noticeable aspect of it is that the election occurred. In the region, it's the only democracy. It's a vibrant democracy. Everyone, Arab, Jew, Christian, has the right to vote. And that's, in a sense, what the rest of the region has to eventually move towards, away from dictatorships and Islamic regimes. So in that sense, it's a great triumph for Israel and its democratic status.
We'll go back to David Sheen in Israel. Talk to us about the monitoring of the elections and overseeing it and how the results were tallied in the end.
Well, there have been some voting irregularities, I'm sorry to say. In a number of cases, you have the computerized results being published online on the government website, but people who actually count the votes saying, no, we conducted hand count and we came up with different numbers altogether. In every case, it was an increase for the right-wing parties and a decrease for the left-wing parties that the official results foretold. So, again, I do not know how widespread this is, but there have been several cases of this. But to the claim that we're talking about this is an example of democracy, really, if the president of South Africa warned hours before the election that there is a fear that Jewish people would go to the polls, and therefore calling out Christian voters and Muslim voters to quickly head there and put their ballots in, would that be considered an example of democracy in South Africa? I don't think so. And I think it's a bit insulting to speak to an Israeli citizen and claim that when you had the Prime Minister making these kinds of racist comments on the very day of the election, not to mention in the weeks preceding and leading up to it.
From your reaction to David Sheen's comment?
No, look, I think the statements of the Prime Minister were inappropriate. I think, as correctly said, it's a country for all its people, and it's a pity that he had to appeal to people's fears, but that happens in South Africa all the time. I mean, the entire ANC election strategy in the Western Cape is to try and convince black people in the Western Cape to keep the whites and colours out, and they use always the example, don't allow an apartheid government to come to the Western Cape. It's electioneering. Some of it's we would want to not see, but it is. It's what happens. It happens in elections all over the world. And what's more important is now what happens afterwards, and what are the actual decisions and conduct of the government going forward. I think that's going to be really what the world and Israel itself looks to, rather than what was said in the lead-up.
Mohammed?
It's unfortunate. I had come out to the studios of ANN7 hoping that the pro-Israeli lobby in this country would have at last joined the Palestinian solidarity movement, would have joined the peace and justice-loving people that are trying to find a just solution for both Israelis and Palestinians. That the South African Zionist Federation's representative comes out here celebrating Israel's Prime Minister, calling for Palestinians not to vote, or calling on the sort of fear-mongering is really unfortunate and desperate.
That's not what
Really what we are seeing today is the PW Botha of apartheid South Africa being re-elected. This is a sad day for democracy, not a celebration of it.
Mr. Kingle, you're saying you're being misquoted? Clarify.
Totally misquoted. I did not condone those statements whatsoever. All I said was that it's more important what the government does going forward, rather than what has been said in the run-up to the elections. But I have to emphasize that in Syria, there's no talk of an election. There are 250,000 people that are dead. Mr. Desai doesn't seem to think that's of much interest to him. But that's the region, unfortunately, that Israel at the moment faces itself in. And the fears of certain of the voters, of an Al-Qaeda now being on the Golan Heights border, and Hamas firing rockets from Gaza, etc. These are real fears that Israelis have, and they have now voted. They have made their decisions. And as any democracy works, that's the government in South Africa. Many people aren't happy with the government that got elected or didn't get elected. But that's it. These are democracies. The people have spoken. And as people throughout the world, we still have to work with both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, to try and reach a two-state solution. That is the only solution to the issue between the two of them. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's complicated by the absolute chaos and mayhem and bloodshed that is swept across that entire region.
If Avram Kringle and the Zionist Federation is interested in a two-state solution, we hope that tomorrow we'll see a statement condemning Netanyahu's declaration that he won't see any Palestinian state. We hope that the South African Zionist Federation joins the ANC, the South African government, and, interestingly enough, the USA government in condemning Netanyahu's utterances.
South African Zionist Federation is 100% supportive of a two-state solution, and we will do everything in our power to assist the South African government in assisting in bringing about a two-state solution, as well as Palestinians and Israelis. That is our position. It has always been our position, and we will continue to hold by it, notwithstanding of what a politician may have said or not said in Israel.
Let's bring Mr. Sheen back into the conversation in Israel. Your thoughts on whether it's just democracy in action and campaigning and people say things in order to get votes?
Well, it's really interesting. It wasn't only the Prime Minister. It was pretty much across the board. You have the Foreign Minister of the country, Avigdor Lieberman, saying that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who he defines as unloyal to the country, should have. Now, we talk about a comparison to ISIS. That's pretty ISIS style, to talk about chopping off people's heads. This is the discourse. Now, is it just electioneering? That's even scarier in a way, because it means that these are the types of sound bites that appeal to the electorate. What this would imply is that it's not only some crazy psychotic politicians, but actually that, scarily enough, these sentiments are widely held among the Jewish Israeli population, and that these kinds of statements would actually draw them to the polls and improve their political standing of the parties who make such statements. But if we look at the actions, unfortunately, we don't look much better, because we have not only the treatment of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, not only the assault on Gaza that my fellow guest spoke to earlier, but we also have rounding thousands of Africans into concentration camps on the border with Egypt. We're talking about several thousand non-Jewish Africans who applied for refugee status. The Israeli government has refused to grant them work permits, has refused to grant them refugee status, and the reason why is because they're non-white, non-Jews. And for that reason, it is rounded, although they have committed again and again, told the government you have no right to put these people behind bars. They've committed no crime except for applying according to international law for refugee status. The government has rounded them into camps. And I don't think you can blame that on Syria. I don't think you can blame that on Saudi Arabia. You definitely can't blame it on Lebanon, who took in over 1 million refugees, or Jordan, who took in over 1 million refugees. You're going to have to blame that on racism. And it's not only the talk, but it's also the actions.
We'll leave the conversation there. Thank you for joining us. Mohammed Desai, the National Coordinator of BDS South Africa in studio. David Sheen joining us from Israel, and Avram Kengel joining us over the phone line from Johannesburg.